let us begin. Welcome everybody to What Do You Think? WDYT. We're beginning to get an audience and we're thankful. And we have three young people this time. We said we've been talking about this age gap between the church and our community, our world. There's a 20-year gap between average Adventist and North American division and the rest of America. And we said, let's talk to three. So here are our three. So you can see my nephew is Andrew Goorhuis. So thank you for being with us. We're very proud of him. You are now what, in an MDiv program with Korpman. Do I have that right? As of now, still from Maine. Down here below, at least on my screen, is Matthew. You said it's Korpman. I have met you, but not really. I just was there when you graduated, and I've been reading your book. So anyway, in graduate school, and thank you for taking time. And Paige, I've met you, don't know you well. You just got married, is that right?
I did. I just got married.
So how long ago was that?
On August 2nd. And these are flowers that dried from the wedding. So
this is like 6 weeks ago, give or take.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. So good for you. Good for you. Anyway, so here we are. Let's have a word of prayer and then we'll jump in. Our Father in heaven, we pray for these, our three young adults who are going to help point us to maybe some ways the church should handle things in the future. We love the church and we want to do what we can to be helpful. We pray for all those who are going to watch and listen. We just pray that these conversations will all add up one by one to transforming the church to really what it will be to make an impact in the world and to bring glory to you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so three bright young adults from last year, university graduates from, we have been wrestling with the issue of the church. We just sort of fell into that. Jim and I talked 2 or 3 times. How do you as 20-something young professionals say, yeah, we have some good things, but we're frustrated or whatever it is you want to say, and let's hear you. Who's going to start? Ladies first. Somebody start. Paige?
I'll go.
Sure.
So I want to say thank you for having us. I think that it is so awesome that you two, Pastor Dan and Jim, are addressing this issue because yes, there is a huge age gap in the church, and that's something that we should definitely talk about. So I think that it's very admirable that you two are doing this. I think that there are probably three things that come to mind that I think I feel like the church could do better at. And for me, the first one is just a general awareness that everything in the world, all humans and animals, we're all interconnected. And so I feel like growing up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there was a very distinct lines drawn between the creator, creatures, and the creation. It's very, I don't know, I guess like an anthropocentric approach to the world. Part of the great thing about studying at Claremont School of Theology is that they are rooted in process theology, which stresses the interdependence and interconnectedness between all living things. And I think that is one of the things that I'm missing in the Adventist Church, particularly relating to climate change. That's something that is really important. But growing up in the church, there's that hymn that's, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. I grew up with the idea that Earth is not my home. It is just a temporary thing. And my real home, the real goal is to get somewhere else, i.e. heaven. And I feel like that just overall approach, view, perspective is detrimental to the environment, and I don't know, we can talk a lot about this. I don't want to
Do you want to
ramble.
discuss each one, or do you want to give all three and then we'll go back to the first one? How do you want to do this?
Okay, yeah, I'll give each one. So the first one would just be just a lack of awareness that everything is interconnected and everything is really important.
Fair enough. Okay, go ahead.
The second thing would be just a general openness to other views. Another great thing about Claremont School of Theology, and one of the main reasons why I applied there, was because they are an interfaith campus. Even though they are technically UMC, they or United Methodist Church, they embrace other religions, and actually the campus in Claremont, which is no longer, but while they were there, they had a Muslim seminary campus as well. So just the idea that we can have relationships and we can talk with other people and even have them be like literally a part of the church or church services of other religions, I think that it's really important as well. It doesn't mean we have to affirm what other people think. It just means that we can get along and we can worship together. And then the last thing I actually am going to save, because it's something that Andrew and I were talking about, and I don't want to steal his thunder.
Okay, so we'll let him do that. So do you want to bring the third one up, Andrew, right now?
I don't know if what I'm thinking of is what Paige is thinking of, but if not, I'm sure she'll correct me. Oh, well, later. That's the constructive portion. But first, I think all of us want to see the church, specifically Seventh-day Adventism, for me in this conversation, rise to the occasion in confronting the issues of the world as it is today and becoming something that makes a difference. For me, I think the biggest obstacle to that, and what disappoints me about the church right now, is its focus on rigid orthodoxy. And I think Adventism's remnant ideology has really disserved us here, because we think that we have what's best for the world, and we think that we have the latter day truth and the outpouring of God's Spirit in a unique and profound way. And while there's nothing wrong with having a stance, when you become rigid and orthodox to the point where you're unable to learn from the people around you, you start to die. And I think that is a major thing we're seeing in Adventism right now. So that's my point for this evening. Adventism is too orthodox, and it needs to begin to widen the breadth of its theological scope, as well as its practical ecclesiological scope, like how we actually do church. And I'll say, my perspective comes from being somebody who's a little bit more forward of a thinker in Adventism. I've grown jaded after feeling rejected in several different spheres. So I just want to acknowledge that that's my location.
Matthew, do you want to jump in here before we take on each of those topics?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I love what Paige brought up about climate change. When I was at Yale Divinity School, I had to take a class on the environment. Well, I mean, I elected to take a class. It's not like you get to choose any classes. I wanted to. But the paper I had to write was to essentially compare three traditions on the issue of climate change and how they reacted. And I was examining various traditions, including the United Church of Christ, and looking at Seventh-day Adventism. And so it gave me an opportunity to try and really look into what the Adventist Church has said. And so what I found fascinating about this is, and it's illustrative of the dilemma that Paige has brought up, is that you look and the statements that come out from the General Conference on this issue, which there are a number of them, and they're all supportive of climate change as real and science, there is no theology in their statements. All their statements are science is real. Science is happening. Science, okay, but like on any other topic, theology is just inundating all the propositions that the GC wants to give or the NAD wants to give. But on this topic, it's very much just plain and stale. You'd almost not know it was from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It's just a general affirmation. And what it indicated to me in comparing it with other denominations and comparing it with how the Adventist Church has dealt with other issues was, oh, this really isn't an issue they understand theologically. This is like creation for them is evolution and that topic. And in fact, that's the only, like when you really delve into it, that's when it starts coming up. But climate change is almost kind of bracketed to the side as its own thing. And so one thing you start to realize is that the Adventist Church has positions that theologically it's not actually delved into or really developed. It's not that there isn't a path there. It's not that there isn't a will there. It's that there's no vision. And people have this idea that's not going anywhere. So the one thing that needs to change there in the Adventist Church is to develop a theological vision and enlarge the vision that the church has already for where these things can fit in, and to give more than, oh, look, we support the scientists. Okay, great. But how is this integral to being an Adventist? How is this part of Sabbath keeping? How can this be part of understanding creation? If those elements are not there, it's no wonder that there's a huge disconnect where the average Adventist you find is, well, what about climate change? Then the NAD officials are like, well, yeah, we support. Well, great. But that connecting bridge there is theology, and it's not there to bridge the two. So I think like that's a problem. But then like I think genuinely you can sum up almost every issue in the church with just simply saying that people recognize the bad consequences that are happening, but they don't want to admit the cause, because if they admit the cause, then they have to fix the cause. And if the cause is our belief systems are, you can go two ways. One is they're crap, they're bad. We got to throw them out. We got to rechange everything. You could go the extreme, or you could go another route and just say that we have possibilities we won't pursue. There's political issues at work, fundamentalist groups, things that cause all kinds of divisions and problems across within the denomination, factions and so forth. You could say that, and certainly you see it at play when the church comes together to talk. But the fact of the matter is, it's like, well, the church is having a problem, but it's like a patient that's in a hospital, but is refusing to admit that they're really doing bad. It's like, no, I'm feeling better, as like, the machine keeps saying it's not doing too good right now. And you got the priest there. And yeah, I'm doing priest on purpose, kind of in gesture here for Adventists. And there's a priest going in giving the sacred rites, and the Adventist sitting there going, I'm doing just fine. You don't need to be here. In fact, I'm a little uncomfortable. I'm going to do great. I'm doing okay. If you won't admit that you're not doing okay.
Is the problem that the church is unwilling to weigh into things that'll divide politically, and so we don't want to take a stand? Is it because our eschatology says the world's going to go to hell anyway, so why should we try to preserve it and keep a beautiful place? It's all going to go to hell. It's going to cost a humongous amount in order to reverse all these trends anyway. What do you think about that? And should the church stand up anyway?
Paige, Andrew, do either of you want to go for it?
I think there are a couple of different levels at which the church can encounter coming to grips with the environmental crisis. And I think maybe the most promising level is with the local churches utilizing their resources more efficiently and better, becoming beacons in their local community for how to do simple things like proper recycling, or doing physical plant upgrades, which is something that I would applaud the local congregations that I see as actively caring for. But there's also a level that I think Matt was talking about in terms of theology, where the church body as a whole needs to influence its members from the top by promoting ideologies that help people make choices in their daily lives for the betterment of the planet. And that's where I personally think a really, really difficult conversation happens for Adventism, because we have to begin to challenge some escapist trends within the Adventist tradition. And so if we're going to come to grips with what it means to talk about climate change, then we need to challenge our 1844 theologies and our sanctuary theologies and our second coming theologies all of that kind of gets flipped on its side, and it may right again, or it may flip all the way over. We don't really know. But I think for Adventism to stay relevant, at least in the theological realm, it has to do that self-traumatizing work.
It's an
Yeah,
either
that's my
or.
thoughts.
We can't hold on to any go to heaven eschatology and still fight to make the world better and keep it as sane as we can.
Adventism will find its unique voice, and I don't know what that is, so I'm going to avoid answering your question, but acknowledge that I'm sidestepping it. But I do think that if Adventism engages those questions, it'll find some of its core theologies engaged, and I don't know where that's going to end up. I fully trust in Seventh-day Adventism to continue to affirm its founding truths, but I don't know what that's going to look like. I think if Adventism...
You started that question. If you feel that church should stand up better on an issue like climate change, Claremont and the people who sponsor that, have they rejected any sort of eschatology that has us leaving here and going somewhere else and no, this is our planet and we're going to do the best we can with it? Or do they have the tension between the two?
I actually am not sure, and I don't want to speak for CST as a whole, but I do know that school is rooted in process theology, which is essentially a recognition that God and the world are interdependent, and God feels pain, and God hurts just like we do. And salvation is no longer a thing solely for human beings. Salvation is for animals. Salvation is for the environment. And so it's sort of redefining the relationship between the creator, creatures, and the creation. All of it is interdependent. Under that, I'm sure you're going to have a lot of different eschatological views. You're going to have a lot of cosmological views. But the point is that we're all interconnected and what we do really matters. And so I think that one of the things about climate change is that we need to address this problem for future generations. And that is true. But at the same time, the things that we can do now can also help people right now. So if you think about developing countries, they are the ones who suffer the most from our first world industrialization, I guess, really, really negative consequences of not seeking sustainable energy or not using renewable resources. And so there's this term, it's actually called environmental racism, where it's the people who are on the margins of society, they suffer the most out of the people in the first world, our actions. And so instead of it becoming just the focus of addressing climate change as being, we can help future generations, it becomes, we can help people right now.
Good.
And that is very Christian. And you can definitely hold a view about having the second coming and being in heaven while helping people right now. I think it doesn't have to be intention.
So just so that we have time to go to the other topics, if you had the ear of the General Conference leader tonight and was listening, you would say the church should call a task force leading to a conference to develop a theology and practical engagement with our world at every level, local church, community, statements from the world church, to address a theology and practical steps on climate change and how it interacts with our theology.
Yes, but just given the current situation at the GC, I don't know if that would be the best way to go about it. I think instead of addressing it from a top-down model, I do bottom-up and just start with churches, start with people like us. And then the only reason why I say that is because I don't envision me being able to appeal and convince Ted Wilson to,
Okay, but
be open to anything that's like radical or new.
many articles have been written in Spectrum and Adventist Today type journals that are progressive, that certainly have a social action component to them, but they're not. So evidently that hasn't satisfied you, the fact that we have intellectuals and we have thoughtful people writing about it. You want the church to speak about this. So to get the church to do it, we have to somehow engage them. Anyway, let's go to number 2, just so I want to make sure we get to more of these. Matthew?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a quick aside. I think that to Andrew's point about like what do we have to do in regards to our 1844 theology, and there's plenty of things that we could do with that. And I've heard so many views on that, it's ridiculous. But aside from that mess, really we can find an analogous situation with, I think, like the Gospel of Luke, right? So I mean, like all the early Christians until the Gospel of Luke imagine that Jesus is coming back, and their generation is coming back real soon. Mark, Matthew, they didn't write their Gospels to be like these histories. They were just like sermons that were evangelizing in the moment. But Luke kind of is weird because he doesn't think Jesus is coming soon, or he's hedging his bets that Jesus might take a while to come, because he's interested in writing a history in some sense, like I'm going to fact check what the other ones didn't. I'm going to try to, opens up his gospel in that sense. But then on top of that, he goes on to write a volume 2 about the history of the church and give a sermon about the church. Who needs to read a sermon about the church that happens after Jesus? Apparently, in his mind, people who come after that church. And so he's thinking to himself that, okay, I still believe Jesus is coming back, but it is taking a while. And we kind of have had some generations die off, and Paul's no longer with us. And I think we have to face reality, a reality that the other gospel writers didn't want to. And the fact that he had that mindset allowed us to have the Acts of the Apostles and not all the other apocryphal acts, which are fun and interesting to read. But, I think in some sense we would have been a little poor theologically if we had the Acts of John or something instead. So I think like Luke's mentality here is helpful to us in terms of thinking through how can we balance the reality of what reality is versus what we also believe it's going to be. And I think like our problems today are just mirrors of issues that early Christians dealt with. And the fact that we don't see that is because, again, we're not comfortable with historical critical work. We're not comfortable sometimes with thinking back and recognizing that some of the people in the Bible did things that sound radical to us now about how they're viewing theology or what hedging their bets. That term itself is a weird one for people to think of Luke as. But I do think that there's a lot more in common with our struggles today with those of the past. And if we can learn from that, I think that it makes the hurdles we see seem a lot less problematic.
Like another good article, Matthew. That's good. That's good. All right. What was the second one, Paige?
The second one was kind of like what Andrew was saying. I think that orthodoxy has kind of is a huge hindrance, I guess, on the church and any growth. So my second complaint or whatever disappointment is that there is no interfaith component to Adventism. I would not say like Adventist theology in general. I'm not like an expert in Ellen White or any of that. But I think that having not only just interfaith dialogue going on, but interfaith community. So inviting, like, what would it look like to have someone of a different religion, not just different denomination within Christianity, but a Hindu or a Sikh or a Buddhist monk to come in and preach a sermon? That would be amazing.
Did you know that I had a Muslim guy take over our church at La Sierra one time, and took 15, 20 minutes to read scripture and do the final prayer. Yeah, anyway, it's a long story. Andrew, what were you going to say?
I don't want to override Paige, but I had a short comment real quick. Both Matthew, Paige, or all three of us, Paige, Matthew, and I, appreciate the work of a theologian named Peter Rollins. And I'm reminded of one of his church liturgies that he does, which is called the Evangelism Project. And Adventists would love to gather around this, but Peter Rollins flips it on his head, and he gathers the parishioners from his own church, and they attend another church, not with the intent to convince the other to join their group, but rather they open themselves up to being convinced themselves to join the other religion. So imagine how radical, how boundary unsettled it would make an Adventist congregation to be brought to even just a Jewish congregation, one that we share so much in common with, celebrating the Sabbath and celebrating the Old Testament, and yet learning from their perspective. That would just bring boons to the congregation, and it would be a fundamental shift in the way people thought about their faith. We can think of an extreme example and imagine our Western Christian expression, our Protestant Seventh-day Adventism, exploring something like an Eastern faith, maybe Hinduism. What would it mean for us to step into their church and allow them to convince us? It makes me come alive to think about those things. And I think that extends, that energy and that life extends to the entire church, if it's framed right and if people can feel comfortable in that space. Anyway, that's just a practical application maybe of this
You
topic.
think it would be helpful if leadership or somehow permission would be given, encouragement would be given for people to explore, to build relationships with other traditions and converse, listening to them and being shared back and forth?
Of course, yeah. I think as soon as my parents took my favorite toy and put it on top of the fridge, as soon as there was a prohibition, as soon as I wasn't allowed to have sex, wasn't allowed to drink, wasn't allowed to smoke, all of those things became exactly what I wanted to do. And so when we tell our children and our youth that there's the devil in other religions, or that other religions are weird or wrong, that creates a certain amount of excitement in the psyche. And closing people off, people don't like that, and they want to explore outside of it. And so it becomes a coming of age experience for our youth to leave church. That's actually a healthy thing for them to do as they break off the shackles that have confined them. So if we can reframe our language to be accepting and affirming and interested in other people's beliefs, then we'll do a much better job of retaining our own, because our own people will be well thought, they'll be well versed, they'll have, anyway, I can keep going, but we'll be raising smart, well-rounded individuals.
I agree with all. I call it being citizen of the world. I've gone to temples and mosques and synagogues and Hindu temples all over the world, and love it and relish it. Scares my mother to death that I'm converting. But Paige, let's go back to the rigid orthodoxy. There's certainly plenty of discussion in the church, but that's not good enough. You know, you're not talking about Spectrum and Adventist Today or La Sierra University. You're talking about as a church. What should we need? What would it look like to not be rigid orthodox?
So I actually have a question for you first, Pastor Dan, and Jim, you can jump in too. Because the way that you phrased it earlier when I said just having like interfaith community within the church, and for example, like church services, you said, oh, that could look like
that's what?
Like a permission, or just, like a conference saying, hey, we are encouraging our local churches to do this. Okay, what if that can't happen? And let's say the 5 of us decide, hey, we're going to start our own gathering. And, we all are Adventists. So, we can meet on Sabbath, but we're going to have other people of different faiths come and talk to us. I'm asking just because I'm curious your view, how you both define the Adventist church. Is it literally the Adventist church, the institution, or can we go outside the church and still be the Adventist church? I don't know if I did a good job explaining that. And Andrew or Matt, if you guys can make it sound better.
I mean, we have that situation. We have China. China's Adventist conference is not a part of the World Church, as I understand, unless someone wants to correct me on that. I believe that was part of the interesting uniqueness about China, because they couldn't officially be part of the World Church because of China's, I think, regulations and stuff on how religion works. So I mean, technically, that's why China's had women's ordination over there, and why they don't care what the World Church thinks about the issue, because they have their own system. They run their own thing. So in some sense, you could say under that sense, they are not Adventists. They're not connected to the World Church, and yet they are. The GC still looks at them perfectly fine. So we already have that in practice, I think, as an example.
I'm not sure we have the question clear yet, Paige. So do you have the question clear, or Jim, do you? Go ahead, Andrew.
So I think I can help clarify a little bit, Dan. And I want to take what Matthew's saying and maybe bring it a little bit closer to home for those of us in the United States of America. And specifically in Southern California with the Southeastern Californian Conference, and then even more specifically with Dan, you and me, when we worked together at Garden Grove, we've seen splinter churches, split-offs, right? That unfortunately generally occur under animosity and frustration and disappointments and personal struggles. And I think Paige's question, it might be rhetorical, is kind of how I'm picking it up, but how do we understand the boundaries of what the Seventh-day Adventist Church is? And would expressions like the church paradox in Southern California, in Redlands, that church broke off from an Adventist church, and I'm not an attendee there, so I'm probably not the authority to speak about it, but my understanding is that it moved just down the street and carried a lot of members who were finding that expression fulfilling along with it. And so it kept its specifically Adventist flavor, and yet it wasn't a part of the denominational church. How do we understand those kind of relations? And what is an Adventist, I think, is kind of the question.
That's spot on.
Cool.
Well,
So-
and almost none of those have ever gone anywhere. So I don't know, we've never had a real viable version of that. Portland, there was a church that went on for 8 years. A friend of mine was the pastor there, Duff Goorhuis, but that died too. And, our former youth pastor at Garden Grove went off, started his group, that died. So almost every group that has tried that, I don't yell at them. If the Bible says, do you believe in Jesus and you keep the commandments of God, you're part of the family of God. And if they do those things, they're good with me. But anyway, go ahead. You want to say something more?
Jim goes.
Jim, you ready?
We've talked.
Sure. I think part of what we're discussing here is that the sociological impact that happens to every movement has hit Adventism, and that it has slidden into the death grip of institutionalism. And so it has lost its ability to be a movement and or to give permission, and it sees a devil behind every bush and flower if you don't line up exactly with the orthodox statement. Some of us have been shot for a whole lot less than what you're discussing, okay? And that's what, when you're back at a movement, you believe in a vital God who lives and moves and walks with you and leads you possibly in different directions than he leads Dan or he leads Jim. And that's not bad, that's good.
You guys know that in Bangladesh, there are thousands of people who look like Muslims, who believe in Jesus and keep the Sabbath. And they're not Adventists by official membership. That's been a debate. And Jim Brauer was commissioned to not continue to funnel money to them. And Jim Brauer continued to funnel money to them anyway. So I have that story about correct, Jim?
Yes, that is correct. So there are members of the official church that think I'm a rebel, which I am.
So anyway, he got sent to Bangladesh after that. But anyway, or at least one of the five of us has put his money where his mouth is. He has personally embraced the thousands of people who are there who believe in many things similar to us, but have no official identity, no official connection. They're not on an Adventist list, but they love Jesus and they believe much of what we believe. Andrew?
Yeah, so I have 2 points to make. One, first, I want to push back on you just a little bit, Dan. And then I want to take the conversation in a new direction. So if you'll give me permission to kind of like have the final word, I don't want to take that for granted. My thought is we shouldn't judge splinter churches that have broken off by the same metrics and standards that we understand our institutional church. So I would disagree with you insofar as you said those churches have failed, and I don't hold you to the gravitas of that word.
Oh, you mean
I think you
small
did.
Groups? They're not meeting anymore.
Right. Sure, but and I think it's important we make that distinction that they may not be meeting, but yet what they did was not a failure. It was actually a success as people experienced a liberative form of religion, and as they felt spirit-led and possessed to express themselves. So I just wanted to push back on that language really quick.
By fail, I mean they're not meeting. You know, no one stopped them.
Right.
By their own struggles to meet their constituency, they died. No one fought them. No one spoke against them that I know of. They just stopped.
And, that's a reality for many groups that I'm not going to push against. I just want to make sure we use our descriptors in a way that aren't offensive.
That's all I mean by the failure.
Burn bridges.
They're not meeting anymore.
Cool. So a word on orthodoxy. Adventism prides itself in its unique message coming out of the Second Great Awakening, which was a reforming message. It was a correction or an enhancement or a growth out of what was. And Adventism prides itself on people like Martin Luther, who was a reformer out of the Catholic Church. Adventists have this kind of bubbling animosity deep in its roots with Catholicism because it prides itself so strongly on its Lutheran roots and its ability to speak against the man, if you will. Unfortunately, I think Adventism has constructed itself so rigidly now in its orthodoxy that it has become the Catholic Church in the Luther Catholicism scenario. And so it's not just these splinter groups, but also I think Jim and Dan, you would both acknowledge that there are lots of people like Matt, Paige, and I who just kind of disappear or fizzle off to the side. A lot of young pastors start pastoring and then they drop out in a few years, or they find other avenues to express their call to ministry. And I think those are all examples of little Martin Luthers who aren't able to nail their 95 thesis to the door and just start their own church. But I want to frame
let's just
our
go
conversation.
Right, what would you need to hear from a church leader to be different than that? So if somebody would say, we have room for you to a point, I'm sure there's not unlimited room, but there's some room to not be cookie cutter. What would you need to hear to say, okay, I am more comfortable with that and I'm proud of what the church just said about that? You want to answer, Matthew? You can go ahead.
I think like the first thing that would need to be said is not there's room for you. That should be a given. So like it's like, you know, it's kind of the same, not the same, but you know, it's somewhat you can relate them. You know, it's like, oh look, eventually we're gonna start recognizing women's order. All right, well there's room for you. Okay, that's nice, but you know,
I understand.
But you putting me here is really not. It's almost as though you're kind of like making me a token, or you're like, oh, it's so nice of you. We'll allow you. We'll give the privilege to be. It's like, no, really, I should have been here from the beginning. This, you know, there should always be a place. It really shouldn't be something we have to fight for or talk about. So there's that. But then oftentimes that's not the case. I know from lots of youth who have gone to GC meetings and been invited to be part of it or whatever. They're tokens. Every single one tells me that. Like,
say what you want. How would you wish it to hear it?
Well, so in other words, like, first of all, not only should we automatically be wanted there, and not because we necessarily are going to say something they have to agree with, but because it's a conversation that needs to be had. So for me, like, I do think a top-down approach is needed for Adventism, and I think for any institution, because when an institution gets so large like Adventism or other very top-heavy denominations, people take their orders, especially when you think about, and this is the big problem, Adventism is not primarily the NAD or the European conferences. It is primarily Africa and Latin America. And that's the problem that it comes from there is that, I talked to a bunch of people and a lot of them that are in these countries, you hear ideas and things that you're like, that is not even Adventist, or that is like that's so extreme, I didn't even know that was a thing that could have developed in Adventism. And you slowly realize they got most of these ideas because of crazy wild missionaries who were very fundamentalist, which is why they wanted to go over in the first place. Sadly, those were the people who were the most possessed to want to go. And so they go sharing not Adventism, but whatever crazy concept of Adventism they had, which only gets worse and worse and more rigid and extreme as that pocket of Adventism develops. So when that happens, how do you fix that? Because they've grown with this as Adventism, even if in some sense they're anti-Adventist in some of their beliefs. So they have this community now. How do you fix that? And that community still responds to the world church. But when you talk to them, they're like, oh, the NAD, they're heretics, they're going to hell. All the North Americans, the Europeans, they've lost it. Only the world church knows the truth anymore.
Focus here, Matthew, if you can. I understand what you're saying about the world church, but you're listening to the church here. We're talking to the church here. We're sending this to conference leaders and to a general conference people. Say what you want to say. What do you need to hear? What would change the environment so that you would say, it's not rigid, there is some flexibility, we can be a voice to actually change the church? What would it take to hear that?
You have to have the people that matter actually having conversations about it. You can't get to a point where I'm going to tell you what you want to hear if they haven't even had private conversations or talks or felt comfortable to talk out loud about these things. So, it's very nice. I published an article about the Apocrypha and early Adventism, and I published another, and I published another. Okay, great. But it's fine to have people come to me and say, oh, I read that. That was really stimulating. Okay, great. But there's lots of implications there that a lot of lay people see, but no church officials are delving into, perhaps. I think some of them have admitted privately because they don't want to. And so when you don't want to start addressing things, but you can't reject them, you're in this weird stagnating area where it's like, okay, we're not going anywhere. I can say, all right, great. I published a book, very controversial. And yet it's not. It's been endorsed by every Adventist publication so far that's come out with it. Even the Adventist News Network republished an endorsement of it. So great, but then are there any conversations about this? Are there people now speaking? No. So it's one of those things where the church can be like, oh yeah, there's room for this. Oh, okay, yes, there's something interesting here. But then, all right, we need to have, if you think this is valuable, then we need to be having conversations, not about my book per se, but about ideas or things that Paige has brought up or Andrew brings up. And we need to have these become mainstream conversations in the church. And yes, I think your earlier suggestion, like creating task force or going ahead and saying, all right, we want each division, or we'd like every conference to come up with proposals and ideas. They need that kind of stuff to be going on, if for no other reason than to get all the officials talking about it, right? Why do we have ASRS meetings or ATS meetings or a number of others as well in Europe, where Adventists come together and they start to speak about some topic for that year? Okay, everyone write papers on this topic and let's discuss this. Why they do that is because it generates research and thought and ideas that previously would have been just the domain of one person who is passionate about it. But now suddenly everyone who wants to contribute needs to do something in that regard. The church, by doing a top-down, hey, we encourage everyone to start talking about, produce documents, do these things, actually gets the church to start thinking and caring about these issues. And that's a way, I think, that the top-down approach can be useful, not in throwing orders down, but in terms of generating conversations from the bottom by giving an incentive.
Thank you, Matt. You just redeemed the top-down approach for me. I think that I am naturally a pessimist. And so when I think about top-down approaches, I just feel like, man, I can't trust those people at the top. Like it's us that needs to like get the job done. But I think what you just said is really good because people do need that incentive. And so you've got my vote. I just wanted to say that.
What if we can't get them to do it? What if we hosted it in Loma Linda? And what if we had, instead of a one project or a GYC, we had thoughtful, open-ended discussions on a variety of topics and involved your generation and others who all wanted to come. And we better make sure church leaders would be there to listen to what they had to say. We can do that.
Good, but I'd say they have to write responses.
I could have
they have to be in it.
What's that, Matthew?
I'd say they have to be in it. I mean, they can't just sit there and go nodding. Like, I think like if you're coming, you're going to engage. It's kind of like I always thought to myself at La Sierra, you know, if we were to invite someone like Doug Batchelor to come over and be a guest speaker for like one of the rendezvous nightly worships or something, like, okay, great. But then if that was to happen, there has to be an agreement that there's a Q&A afterwards. He has to sit down afterwards and have a conversation with a very intelligent theology student, someone who will like push him on the issues that he pointed out and have a genuine interactive conversation on that. You have to have it. You can't just have church officials show up and be like, okay, well, we listened to you. Oh, okay, great. But then you need to have a conversation. You need to bring your own thoughts, and then you need to be able to converse with what you've heard and show those things. Sometime
when we're off camera, I'll tell you my La Sierra experiences with having Doug Batchelor come to speak.
Oh, that happened before. I've never heard.
I've been in the room.
I am very intrigued.
We had those conversations because I was for diversity.
Yeah, same.
You know, the only college church that ever had Sam Bakayoko preach in their church. So here we are with the prodigal son statue out in front and saying we're open-minded, and we can only bring people from one side of the spectrum to speak. I said, what does that mean? If that's all we can do. And Larry Garrity and I went against that. And we said, we're last year, it means we can bring people from across the spectrum. Anyway, we did that. Andrew, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I'm glad Matt covered me after you asked that question, because I had a really like guttural response to it, an emotive response. I think I'm trying to remember because it's been a little bit, but you had asked if the church acknowledged that it had room for me, what would that be? What would that take? I agree with Matt completely in that the power differential is still unaligned there, in that when somebody makes room for somebody else, that doesn't feel very good. And like, no, this is a church, I grew up here, the room is already there. I think that if...
Well, don't quibble too much about that. What would you like? Tell us what you would like. How would it be characterized in a way you would be comfortable with it?
I don't think the church would be willing to give what would make me personally comfortable.
Not anything yourself. Say what you think it ought to be.
Okay. So an example, just a few days ago, Pope Francis came out with an affirmation for homosexual civil unions. And that to me was so life-giving and so happy to read that the probably biggest religious voice within the Christian world was able to affirm that. That would be what I would, if somebody's making room for me, then they're making room for that. The Adventist Church hasn't even been able to affirm women yet. And so I would, I don't know, that's just one example. I don't think the church is ready to give as much as it thinks it is. If we're talking about room for me specifically, that's just one area. There are others as well. Yeah, but that's all I've got.
Matthew's talking about conversation. Conversation about it is different than the Pope saying this is okay. That's just one person.
The Pope,
hierarchical system.
Sure, that's true. But the Pope is beginning the conversation, and even being as top down of a system as Catholicism is, the Pope can only start that, and Adventism would benefit from that as well.
No question. We would all love that. But that's one thing we don't have so much influence over. But we can, there are people listening to this, and who knows what they will go with it. So Jim, you want to speak to that?
Wait, I just want to point out one thing quickly, which is Catholicism is not as hierarchical as or simplistic as we make it seem. I mean, in the sense that, like, just because Pope Francis says something does not mean half the church doesn't, in the Catholic Church, goes, can't wait to replace him. Okay, like, I mean, the papal infallibility is, maybe some people believe it, but like, there's plenty of Catholics who are like, yeah, no, it doesn't work that way. He might say, I mean, in fact, there's even, I cover in my own book, like there's stories about how, like, there's this one reporter in Rome that Francis has gone numerous times to give interviews for. And every time that the comments are posted in the newspapers, the Vatican goes, they're not real, they're not official, that the Pope does not stand by, it was misrepresented. But like, it's never Francis saying that, but and he keeps going back. And so some of the things, like he said, have been like,
the Pope
you know,
doesn't believe in hell anymore.
yeah, like the issue in regards to hell and believing in annihilationism and stuff. Like, when you can see, like, there's controls in regards to the papacy, just like any president or any leader. They're a symbol head. They can have their opinions. They can try to move things, but at the same time, it's not like they get to just go out there and say this is what it is, because they can be declared, you know, as having been flawed, or their idea being wrong by the rest of the Vatican. There's lots of factors involved. So I think it isn't too much of a stretch to point out, like Andrew, that the Pope is using his position to put out a message carefully through a documentary, not even like a big statement, something prepared, just sneaking it in, knowing it's going to get out there. And I think, like, those things affect things. And I think that certain leaders in the Adventist Church, every time they say something radical or interesting or progressive, it leaks, it goes out, and suddenly, like, it encourages people to go, oh, good. So it's not like the church is dead upstairs and we're all just waiting for the bodies to be carried out. There's people still moving up there. That's great. And I think we need that.
Good. Jim, you were going to come in or no?
Yeah, I want to check out a hunch because I'm trying to figure out the disconnect. It sounds like we have a fundamental epistemological redefinition of what church is, or what thinking is, or what the mission is. And so a model that I like is Hebert's model in his book. Here's a great title for you: Missiological Implications of Epistemological Shifts. Okay, don't you like that title? It's great. It's a great book, because what I see happening currently that frustrates the younger generation is the church has reacted to postmodernism and gone back into modernism, doubled the walls, made them twice as thick, and continued to drink the Kool-Aid of positivism. So they are positive that they are right. They have the final message. They are going through blah, 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 and there sure can be no deviation allowed. And what Hebert tries to say is the church must move through postmodernism and affirm the postmodern mindset and get to a point where you begin to use the disciplines of critical realism to determine what is left. Because right now, we are all sick of the political world. We're praying for November 3 to be over because you don't know what's what. And that also is what's happening in the world, is people are getting sick of religion. I tell people, if I wasn't born an Adventist, I doubt that I would ever find the Adventist church, because I can't stomach television preachers. And where does that lead us? As we try to say, God is really good. He's not the way you think he is. And people don't want to hear it because they don't want to hear anything. They're tired of the religious garbage and the positivistic attitude that we're right, you're wrong, and I don't know about you because you don't part your hair the same way I do. Okay?
I like what you're saying, Jim. I think that the church has often fooled itself into thinking that it's still strong, because the dwindling population that affirms a modernist and a capital T truth viewpoint, maybe we could say, continues to shrink into itself and continues to boister itself by being louder and louder and louder with its complaints and frustrations and after affirmations of the truth. So I think you've diagnosed Adventism's and a larger Christian in the Western world scenario with that. I think that's really good. I'm very interested by what you had to say.
So what's the answer to it?
Matt, you're raising your hand.
What's the cure?
I think that, you know, what you're calling critical realism, I know from other philosophers is starting to be called like metamodernism, trying to find the next step, because in some sense there's a Danish philosopher who talks about how post-modernity is impossible, because postmodernism is simply unlike other worldviews, it really isn't a worldview, it's a tool for a worldview. And so it can't metastasize, because deconstruction can't be a worldview, it can't be your foundation, it's something you apply to other foundations. So we need that next step. And I think we see this, honestly, your critiques, your points are really not just only in regards to how we think about Adventism. It's true for the wider culture. There's lots of issues. I mean, and just take issues regarding racism and listen to the discourse that's going on in regards to social justice. And you'll very quickly hear people who come from a postmodern worldview who are reverting to a modernist worldview in terms of assumptions about right and wrong and other things, regardless of how you feel about it. But you can tell they're not being succinct in their worldview, precisely because postmodernism goes in a direction that defeats the whole point. They want to change the world. They don't want to just deconstruct everything and leave it in shambles. They want to create something better. So we're all, I think, sharing in this struggle to try and seek out a new, better view. And I think that to do that, we have to be willing to recognize the kind of messy reality we live in, but we're also going to have to realize that the NAD might have a dwindling number of modernists within it who are yelling louder and louder. But you go to Africa and there is great numbers, right? If the majority of the world church is firmly modernist, and not even they've been modernist, they're becoming modernist. They are understanding these views and growing into them. And I think that when we see that, we have to recognize that the church is not going to suddenly be able to introduce the postmodernism and then metamodernism to those communities immediately to bring them up to speed. So the church is going to go through a different transition in different areas, and we have to come up with a model that accepts that and welcomes that, and at the same time still coheres to unity in some sense.
Which is next to impossible. If you've been to Africa and Asia, for them to accept what they know to be heresy.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah. Andrew?
I read an article, I think in the book Decolonializing Josiah by Uriah Kim, to source myself, who is a Korean theologian, I think Korean American, maybe just Korean. He talks about the, Matt, I just saw your text. Good luck on your final. I know you've got a piece out in a few minutes.
Matthew.
You're still muted, Matt.
Thank you for joining us. God bless you in your test. And I hope I can email you back and forth. I'm going to follow up on your article. I've lived through the Des Fort era. So anyway, we'll proceed further in the future.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. And I will bid adieu and stretch my legs for 2 minutes. So thank you.
Come back out to the West Coast. We can talk more.
All right. And definitely Paige and Andrew are going to carry this in amazing directions going forward. So it's so good to see both of you together. It brings back memories.
All right. God bless, Matthew.
Bye.
Okay. We got a few more minutes, Andrew. So let's be as focused as we can. Be as helpful as we can. What can you want to go from here?
It's the After Dark podcast now. Everybody pull out your beers and your smokes, right? We can let loose. So I was reading this article by this theologian, Kim, and what he was talking about, I'm trying to synthesize my thoughts. I'm sorry if they're a little unclear, but it's a very bourgeois and entitled position as a Anglo first world theologian to expect people to shift into the uncertainty of postmodernity like we have placed ourselves. And it can actually be racist and classist and sexist to do that, because to expect people from other parts of the world and other worlds to suddenly fall into this place where it's very difficult to find a voice and very difficult to take a stance. We're actually working to silence the very modern need for people to find concrete positions out of their racial and sexual and gender and species backgrounds, for lack of a better word. So I think it's important that the church finds a way to celebrate the very modern views that are emerging from places that are, and people groups that are just beginning to find their own voice. So that's a note. That was something I'd heard for the first time from Dr. Kim, and really, really appreciated reading, because I'm somebody who thinks that I'm the best place. I'm where the best stuff is happening and wants everyone else to be where I am. And I was like, oh, I should be a little bit more humble. That's all.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting how postmodernism can be used to silence people as well.
Which defeats the whole point of postmodernism.
Exactly. Yeah, because postmodernism acknowledges the specific location and the value based out of those specific locations of every single voice.
Yeah, well, I mean,
and so we have to.
In the middle of the last year is political hierarchy discussions in the Spiritual Life Council and all these other. Last year, I had a core curriculum that they wanted every single student to take, no deviations, no variations. And in that they wanted to pursue a postmodernist viewpoint, which says no one has the right or knows what is the correct view. So how can you say postmodernism now is the correct view and push that, which defeats the whole point that you can't know that, and it just becomes a logical circle. But it was a very traumatic time for a few years, and last year's enrollment went down to 1,100 students, in this battle for the soul of the university. So
that's one of the.
Go ahead.
Sorry, that's one of the beauties of postmodernism, is that it calls us to analyze ourselves, right? And that meta consciousness, that ability to see ourselves from outside of ourselves, helps us grow in countless ways as we examine the choices that we make.
Now, when you first emailed me about this project, you said you would maybe be able to articulate a vision of a church that you could be a part of, or you could lead, that would be attractive to you, and you think could attract others. You want to get to that before we wrap up?
Wow. Sure. This is a long answer. The first part would be theological, and we've riffed on that for an hour, so I don't want to touch that. The second part.
What do you mean, real quick?
So when you asked if the church made room for me, I felt like you were asking what kind of a space would accommodate me as an individual and where I'm at. So there are just a lot of theological assumptions that come with me that I personally and biasedly think the church needs to step into a new world, like our conversations on environmentalism, gender, race, sexuality, those kind of conversations. But we've spent time with that, so I don't really want to focus in on that again.
But that would be helpful in your mind, that list of things, that
Mm-hmm.
family of things. If the church was discussing them, having a conversation about them, hammering out theologies on those things, and going engage with other conversations with other entities in the world, that would be inspiring to you.
That's part one.
Okay. I just wanted to summarize what I heard. Go ahead.
Paige.
I just want to add one thing. It's not just the fact that conversations are happening. Conversations are great, dialogue is important, but also affirming. So we can write all the articles we want about women's ordination or LGBTQ rights. But at the end, personally, I want to hear the affirmation of things that people like Andrew and I just assume are obvious, like it's okay to be gay. Just like the way I said it right now, it was like, I'm about to say something really crazy and progressive and radical, but no, like you're a human and I'm a human. Okay.
So
So
you're
the different dialogue,
to lead to affirmations.
yes, affirmations. Yes, yes.
Go ahead.
Part two has to do with practice. I think a lot of people would agree that our churches are losing 6/7 of their value throughout the week. We generally focus in on Saturday, or for other denominations, Sunday, and then we forget to utilize the building and the resources that are being taxed and being the rent that's being paid, all of that draw, we fail to make on that investment throughout the rest of the week. So I think a way we can reframe the practical conversation of church is in regards to service. What I'm saying here is not, it's very basic. We've been here before, but I affirm it and want to do so here. So we often look at the service on Saturday as being a service to God. I think that that's beautiful, but that's mistaken. And the church will begin to thrive when it can conceptualize service as something happening 7 days a week, or 6 days a week, or 5 days a week through the weekday ministry of the church. And it's important that we don't serve people with something that they don't need or want. And so I help the BBB, whatever condensed phrase to remember here is belong, behave, believe. We should invite people to be with us before we start to try to change the way they believe with Bible studies or something. We should help them grow into healthier and more full humans after they've felt safe in our boundaries. And then after that, perhaps if we're lucky, our ways of thinking will have an influence on the way that they choose to think as well. A specific model that for me personally, this is not a statement of anywhere beyond what is individual for me, but I think it would be really, really fun to run a church out of a home that would be based on outdoor recreation. And this fits really well with the Adventist health message. I'm really, really lucky to have grown up in a home in a rural part of the country, right outside of a pretty major city within the state of Maine. I live on a lake. I live within 2 miles of a cross-country ski plowed location. I live on bikeable roads. I live within 3 miles from fields. And if I could have somebody to give me investment of sports equipment and a vehicle, and then if I could organize the legal side so that I could bring disenfranchised people from the city out to this home to facilitate for them outdoor activities to help them grow with team building skills, learning, feeling comfortable outside in nature. That is a service that is real. And with America's obesity problem, that's something that meets a real need and makes a difference in people's lives. We're terrible with health, and providing something like that could be a recreational and a health boon to people would be awesome, just to give free outdoor recreation. And finding a way not to undercut local business while doing that would be a great model for a church. Of course, we do a service on Saturday or Sunday or Friday night, but I wouldn't even advertise that, because the real ministry, the real work of Christ would be happening when we all go water tubing or something on Tuesday afternoon after school, and then eat some pie, because I like pie. That's like a practical model that I think would be really, really awesome. And I think if we abandoned our high church idea of going to a service for God on Saturday and learn to exchange that for different expressions of practical service throughout the week, the church would explode. That's not radical. Adventism has been saying that. It's just really hard to make it happen. And unfortunately, we have preconceived notions that are hard to get out of.
I'd sign up tomorrow if you do that church.
Right? It'd be a lot of fun, wouldn't it? And that's the awesome part, is that you think of it as something fun. You don't think of it as obligating your religion or serving God. You're just like, no, that's a good time. I want to go play pickleball with my friends. And then suddenly it becomes the cornerstone of your life. And you see Christ every day in it.
That was actually the third thing that I was going to mention, because Andrew and I spoke a little bit about our own visions for the church and expanding that to not just include outdoor activities, but just like services that the community needs on a daily basis. So like after school programs, I think about like classes, like cooking classes, how to have like healthy relationship classes, things like sex education, just practical things that people need on a daily basis. And something that I think that could be a selling point, or whatever, is that we are not only embracing salvation as this thing that is to come, but we are now shifting our view to the salvation that's here and now, which is to transform people's lives. I think of our academies. I was lucky enough to go to academy my whole life, and it's the perfect place to start, doing these sorts of like outreach community things, providing for the community.
And sitting there empty for half the day.
Yeah.
Very good. Very
Andrew
good.
said something and I was going to comment, but I forgot. So I'll just have to put a pin in that.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that. Just for this page, just, because obviously I've been close to Sarah May Cologne and we have discussed many of these kinds of things. The challenge in America is to try to find where there's a niche that's really needed, that we can fill, that not 15 other people are already doing, either a nonprofit or the government. When we tried to start a after-school tutoring program, for Vietnamese, there were 40 already in Orange County. The number of English language schools for Vietnamese communities was off the charts. So trying to find a niche that isn't already being done by everybody, where we can have something to offer, is not simple. Overseas, I know exactly what to do because the need's right in front of you. It's trickier to find in like Orange County where that need is, and something that we have a resource to give to it, and not be up against many others trying to do it. I'm just saying it.
But why can't you just join forces? Why can't you just join forces?
We could, and those are all options, and that's what the Marufos chose to do, is to work with the Giving Backpacks Away with another ministry.
Yeah.
We
and
got
then talk about
because no one knew that the Adventist Church was in the middle of it, and so
that's okay.
Debate over that, but yes, we gave away 800 backpacks and had 40 booths in a place with all kinds of other people doing them. Yes, we did. Yeah, it was good.
So I think it's important to recognize that when we do ministry, we don't need to have our brand attached to it. Jesus doesn't need that, and neither do the people that we're ministering to.
I know that's probably how you feel. Obviously, we had a lot of people on the other side of that. That we didn't do it. We didn't do it in order to get the brand, but Jesus did always point to spiritual realities when it's after he healed people physically, and so he combined the two. Doesn't do one to do the other, but it's another debate. But we can certainly explore it. I'm just saying it's not easy in an American society with all the nonprofits and all the NGOs and all the government facilities and all the other churches also trying to do something, to try to find something that we can really contribute. It's a challenge, because we have spent many hours looking for those kinds of things. But
it's hard.
A church that figures it out. Absolutely.
It's hard, and it will be unique in every different place. And like Paige said, it's not worth competing. Just join them. If Jesus is already at work, just grab his hand and keep walking.
It was amazing. A fellow pastor of mine got $50,000 in a donation. I got 50, he got 50 from one donor. And he took most of that 50 and wrote checks to other ministries in that community, rather than fund it into the Adventist Church and do something. He said, "You're already doing it. Let me give you money. 2,000. Yeah, you'd be happy with it."
I think with our conversation on orthodoxy, really what that is an exercise in pride, when people can't be humble enough to recognize that there are equal viewpoints in the world that are different than theirs. And sometimes we do that with our ministry too. We think that this is our Adventist church, we've got to do it. We'll find the best place to apply. Like, no, if we're humble, we'll realize that like there are probably people who are already specialists and we can support them. Yeah. There's a third portion to my dream about the church.
Ralph Watts, I spent an hour with Ralph Watts today. He gave $60,000 to Sarah's Propel group in Manila to do a clinic for women. And he's not going to get any credit. He'll never have his name on it, but he just did it because it needed to be done. Yes, good. Go ahead. Your last point. We've got to wrap it up.
So we have to talk about the Bible. And we have to do that because we're Christians and because that is our informing text. That's our special revelation. That's where we get our picture of God from. If Jesus walked on this earth as God, none of us, unfortunately, have been able to meet that bodily figure. And so we know of Jesus through the Bible. So it's obviously integral to our Adventist faith. And I think it deserves a place in this ideological reformation of the church. I was lucky enough to teach at an Adventist academy, teach high school Bible last year, and really enjoyed exploring the book of Daniel with some of my students. But a thing I found was that none of them, although probably 45 of them grew up steeped in Adventism, really knew the Bible stories like I had been raised to know them. And I think that's a symptom that we're seeing in a lot of different kids these days, is they don't really know, they don't have that grounding. They didn't watch enough VeggieTales or something. And so it was really fun exploring text for the first time with them. But I think we can do it in a better way. And I want to highlight two books, Daniel and Esther. And I want to highlight Daniel because it's a very Adventist book. We generally teach Daniel like it's truth, like Daniel existed amidst, and here we go with some biblical discussion, but amidst the Babylonian exile after Judah had been conquered and taken up. And Daniel predicts the future. And Adventist theology gives a description of what the four kingdoms mean, along with a prolonged expectation of the divided kingdoms with the dirty iron and clay feet. We can also look at this text a different way. And I think looking at the text in a non-orthodox fashion helps children to begin to explore their faith a little bit deeper. So in our class, we went over the Adventist assertions about the book of Daniel, and we affirmed them, and we allowed children to adopt them as their own students. But then we spent some time comparing the book of Daniel and the book of Esther as two very different takes within the Bible, two competing opinions about the same concept. So we have the book of Esther, which shapes a story around the Persian period. And so in biblical history, the Babylonians conquer Judah, they take them up to Babylon, then the Babylonians get kicked by the Medians and the Persians, and the Persians let the Israelites go home. But there are some Jewish people, some Israelites who stay in Persia, and Esther is one of those people. So we have a book of Daniel, which is talking about how do we stay Jewish amidst the Babylonian captivity. And then we have the book of Esther, which says, how do we stay Jewish? How do we preserve our people amidst the Persian diaspora, this Persian separation from our home? And they give different answers. Daniel says, we've got to stay true to Torah. We've got to stay true to these different cultural expectations about what it means to be Jewish. And those cultural expectations sound a lot like our Adventist ones about being vegetarian and keeping the Sabbath and not touching electronics after sundown on Friday. And then we have Esther, which doesn't even mention the name of God, in which Esther says, God's not going to solve your problems. You got to solve them yourself. And here in the Bible, we have two competing viewpoints that we've got to decide between. And when we present them like that to the kids, and this is just an example, there are a plethora of different places in the Bible where we find these disagreements. The kids come alive because they're like, oh, I can relate to that. I've been brought up in this way, this Daniel way, where God is going to solve my problems as long as I'm faithful enough. But the reality I'm experiencing sounds a lot like Esther, where I've got to solve my own problems. And they were captivated. And that was one of my favorite expressions and moments in class. And of course, I'm the teacher, so I like to think I did a good job. The reality was probably different. but we need to reimagine the way we're teaching the Bible.
Okay. Good. That's a great testimony.
Rant. Okay, cool. Thanks. Sorry about that.
You were going to say something?
I want to be in your classes.
Yes.
we are in classes together, Paige.
But
For
when
what
you're
reason
teaching,
the kids are not going to have the access to Andrew Goorhuis or someone like you. I told you that. You had a gift to give those kids. And anyway, but you may go back to it someday.
Well,
We
I don't.
we probably have to come to an end here, though I would love to have an hour a week with you guys. These are the kinds of conversations the church has to have. I'm trying to think of how I can host a conference where we could have 100 of you all talking in various task forces, but we'll have to figure that out.
Dan,
Go
I've
ahead.
got one more word.
We've got to come to a wrap. We're gonna have to split this into two.
Give me one more.
Okay.
I'll keep it short, I promise. This generation, the generation that the church is afraid of losing, grew up in postmodernity in this grand smorgasbord of take whatever you want, you can have it. And that's been really difficult for us and for the kids younger than me. I'm only 24. But because of that, this generation has become immensely creative. And when the church affirms orthodoxy, whether through its interpretation of Bible, its actual practical experience, or its theological assertions, it's stifling the creativity that these kids live off of. So whenever you see kids with their phone dancing weird dances to it, they're being creative using TikTok, this annoying app that I have to deal with as a teacher in class, but they're being themselves. So if the church wants to keep these kids, then it needs to drop its pretense of being the authoritative voice, and it needs to let this generation create. And that, I think, is the most succinct way I can say how the church can help keep the generation to come.
Dick,
All
take one
done.
more
Thank
sentence, because obviously that's scary. I've been in the room when my nieces began to challenge things, and my mother just can't stand it. You know, it's so scary to her is that somehow her relatives, her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren would deviate very far and not be in heaven, and we would do heaven without them. So how do we do this well and say you can talk about it, we can open up ideas without scaring everyone to death that we're all going to lose something that is precious to us. God is precious to me. Bible is precious to me. But if you talk to me too far, you may take it somewhere that I lose the preciousness of it, and I'm scared for my sons.
We have to find a way of affirming both sides of the conversation, right? People who are, we'll say, conservative in the sense, even though that's a triggering and a charged word, shouldn't be left behind either. This is kind of an aggressive thing to say, but for the Adventist church, passing away is totally an option. And if that's what
And thank everybody for watching. And thank you too, and Matthew for investing in this. Matthew, Andrew, it's late for you. And Paige, you're out here, right? You're on the West Coast. Yeah, okay. But thank you guys. And thank you for being serious about it. Thank you for taking the time in your lives to care about it. And I've said this to Andrew in the past, even though we look really old, me older than Jim, we like to think young, and we certainly care about you guys and about the friends that you represent.